The One I Love tells a story of a couple who just can't seem to get it together, even though they try to reminisce on past experience that they had, trying to hopefully get a spark. As you see, one of the experiences actually on the poster, they just can't seem to click. So what they do is, as they're seeing their therapist, he tells them to go to this sort of vacation home for a weekend, and where every couple that he sent there ends up coming back with positive results. So they decide to take him up on it. And the interesting thing about this movie is that that's pretty much all you know going into it, which I found to be very interesting, because you're left with be it a romance movie, but one that you don't have everything completely spoiled for you. So it's intriguing, and going into it as I went, not even knowing anything about it, it catches you sometimes off guard when things start popping up on screen. And even more so if you see the trailer, it seems pretty intriguing the way that they set it up. Be it may be hyping it up a bit too much, but I think what you end up getting at the end, whether you like the whole outcome or not, is a movie that is a lot better and feels a bit more advanced than your average romance film, which I think is a good thing. And just getting into a basic overview of the movie, because I'll have my spoiler discussion at the end, is that I found it very interesting that they barely even had a cast with this. You really only had Mark Duplass, who you may know him from The League, and he was playing the husband. There was Elizabeth Moss, who you may know her from Mad Men, she was playing the wife. And then there was Ted Danson, who was the therapist for them, and I believe he also was running a bar during the night. But I think that even without that large cast, they were really able to work well with each other, and I think that it worked very well, especially having these two, because they look like a normal couple. They're not ugly, but they don't have that Hollywood thing, you know, going on where they look like they're fake people, like these paper cutouts. They actually seem relatable. So when they're going through these things, especially in the beginning, you can actually relate to them, and seeing the aspects that they're facing about having a relationship with someone, and seeing what they were like in the beginning, and then looking at the person that they are now, and evaluating if they really are that same person who you fell in love with. And the way that they're able to do that, I think, goes very well, because they really get into their characters. However, once you get to that part of the story, it may have already been too overhyped, that it just doesn't deliver the way that they intended to, or it may, you know, come out a little bit too cliche or unoriginal, because it has semi been done before, but I still think that it has as much original stuff to keep it, you know, different than what the rest have been. But definitely the best way to talk about it is to get into the spoiler section. So if you haven't seen the movie, I definitely recommend going to watch it and, you know, just getting your own point of view, whether you like it and just being able to experience it, or if you have already seen it or just don't care. Let's get into the spoilers in 3, 2, 1. Now, just covering what really happened, you see that they were sent there by the therapist into this place where so many people have been, you know, helped, and you see all the pictures that they have, and you realize, you know, before they even do, that there's clones of them there. They just don't realize it. And the way that these clones work is that they're sort of like a younger but better version of them. They seem like the version that they started dating, or, you know, before they got married, but they also are a sort of modified version. You see it with the wife actually cooking bacon. You see it with the husband, the clone husband, actually not wearing his glasses, working out. So it's like the version that they want their spouses to be. At the same time, the rules that they're going with is that the only way that the original husband and the original wife can be with the clone husband and the clone wife is that if it's only them two separated as pairs, either just by themselves in the shed or alone in the house, which I thought was an interesting dynamic, which they sort of ruined later on in the film. However, just that idea of the couple actually wanting to stay and not just, you know, get the heck out of there, but they actually wanted to experiment with it, was pretty interesting, because it brings up ideas of, is it really cheating if it actually is your spouse? And is it you getting jealous of someone else if it's actually yourself? And I thought that was interesting, the way that they handled that and the dynamic that they have with each other. But upon that, there's that second twist that comes in where you realize that it's not actually their clones, but people who have been cloned to be them. The previous couple who was there, who's trying to entrap them so they can then stay there, and then the next people come, and it becomes this sort of cycle, which I think brings upon a lot more plot holes, but I thought was an interesting, you know, second twist to have in the movie, especially when you see that all of the therapy sessions in the beginning, you know, them playing the piano, their voices, all of that was just to become this transformation for the couple that was already stuck there. And the way that they're, you know, calling other people, which I thought was one of the funniest lines, like, what cell phone plan do they have? And the way that they're, you know, it's sort of creepy the way that they were trying to gain all this information to become them, is still very, you know, cartoony, but at the same time was an interesting aspect to have in the movie. However, that does bring up a lot of the things in the movie that don't necessarily make sense. And even though they have a line, which I think comes from the clone husband, where he says, you know, sometimes these things happen in nature and you just have to go with them. That's an excuse. You know, sometimes you're writing a script and you got to make sure you have all the answers. Now, of course, they start from the beginning with the whole elements of when they actually are trying to discover this, and they go inside the house, yet they close the door behind them. Like, why the heck would you do that? Of course, it seems like a convenience for the script, so it works out with the little, you know, ideology that you have there. But it does coincide with this whole fact that while I wish there was an answer to most of it, which I do think that there are still parts that can't have that, there is that whole fantasy element. The fact that this previous couple can transform themselves to look like them, even though they also keep that computer there to have all the files for whatever reason. But the fact that the previous couple can actually look like them and sound like them, the fact that they actually disappear and reappear even though they're supposed to be human beings, because anytime they enter the house, you know, they just vanish. There is that element, you know, that side of fantasy to it, which is okay. There are some other parts, though, which do need answers. For example, what are the guidelines for this whole thing? Like, how did they discover this? The fact that they have this power to clone people and do these things, why isn't this whole thing being used for something more incredible than just couples therapy? Alongside that is the whole mentality of the clone couple can't really escape. They can't leave until they convince the other couple to stay there, which I thought was interesting. But then at the same time, there's a point when they all see each other, and what constituted that to happen. And then you see at a certain point later on where the original husband, Mark Duplass, can't get out of the house, and that's supposed to be explaining that, oh, you know, she's starting to not love you, now you're being stuck in here. But for convenience's purposes, we're going to let you, for whatever reason, you know, not be trapped in here so you can go to the other side so we can finish off the movie. And that was one of the parts where I felt like they weren't really keeping into the rules of this mythology that they had. Also, what are the chances that someone owns the exact same pair of clothing, you know, twice, but at the same time also brings it to the retreat that they're going on where it's just only going to be their husband, unless of course it's a convenience to the story writing, which that's going to help them, you know, get to the end. On top of that was the sort of, you know, it actually was the biggest cliche of the movie, where he doesn't know which one is his wife and then he chooses the one which is obviously the wrong one, which then I think sort of ruins the whole twist ending with the whole bacon, and he realizes that, oh my gosh, he chose the wrong one, even though it would have been better if you didn't make it so obvious 5 minutes before that. But the other things that the movie definitely had a problem with was, one, the therapist is nowhere to be found, but then one, how did someone reference you to him? Or two, how did you find him if he's just make-believe? The other thing is, what has happened to all the other couples who have gone through this and then have been released? They just didn't go to the police or say anything. They were completely alright with it. And what are the chances that this was the first time where they switched out like that, that someone else hasn't been, you know, stuck in there, and the people who have been stuck in there just compliantly go with the rules. They don't try to find another way out. I think there was so many other things that they could have answered, but of course, the way that they tried to cover it up is with that one line from the clone husband where he says, you know, sometimes these things just happen and you just have to go with them. Not always. But I'm curious what you thought about this film, if you were able to check it out, if you thought that the twist actually helped the film, if you knew what the twist was, if it just did not work for you, and just what you thought about the acting, what you thought about the story, pretty much anything else having to do with this movie, or anything else that you wanted to add about it. Let's talk about it down below in the comments, and until next time, I'll see you guys later.